I don't know if any of you have had a similar experience, but when I sleep in the same room with somebody else, and that person wakes up, I usually wake up too. Not because the person tries to wake me up, or makes any noise or anything. It just happens. This happened a few months ago. I'm sleeping in my room. It's the middle of the night, and I suddenly wake up. The sensation when I woke up feels the same as said above, except I am alone in the room, or at least I think. I open up my eyes. The first thing I see is a silhouette, leaning above me, staring into my face from several centimeters. The funny thing is, it's not leaning above me from beside the bed, but it's standing there through the bed at me. It does not have eyes as we know them. I'm just staring into a pair of black vortexes and a blue-white, semi-transparent silhouette. And it's not the only one in there. There are 3 or 4 of the others in the room too. The impression I have about them is like they're looking over my room, nodding their heads and thinking, "Oh, that's a nicely decorated room here." It takes me a few moments before I process, because I'm still half sleeping. But when I realize I am suddenly full awake, scared as heck. At the same moment, they are gone. Or maybe they are still there, but I just can't see them. It feels more like in the moment of realization that I got fully awake. I just couldn't perceive the part of specter they are in. I don't know how to describe it better. And that's it. I'm sitting on my bed, trying to replay the situation in my head, and try to think again what that was about, without any chance to fall asleep again. Okay, it's been a little while now since this happened. It was sometime in mid-2013. I was living for quite a while on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. I had a good friend coming visit me from Mississippi, a place I've lived before. I was thinking, what is the one thing I could show him that would really blow his mind? So, one of the more obvious answers I thought was, I'll show him this really cool valley. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this place, but it is truly one of the most beautiful and alien places on planet Earth. Getting to the valley requires at least 11 miles of hiking, and there are no roads to get there. I had been there before, a month or 2 ago, and was completely blown away. So, we set up our provisions and whatnot for camping, only for 2 nights, and I got a friend to get us a boat ride into the valley, bypassing the hike in. 2 days later, we get on a beautiful ride in the morning, and we get to ride in by cliff's edge and through the caves with luminescent water and tides cascading and canopying over tiny islands of rock near the land. Amazing. Arriving at our destination, we jumped out into the water with our things in giant trash bags so they did not get wet, and making our way to land. We do a short little hike to the beach where we will be camping. I think we set up camp somewhat. After relaxing a little bit, I realized that the beach is way lower tide than the last time I visited. My adventurous spirit began to move my legs toward the extra beach. We walked for quite a long time, maybe even a mile after where the beach ended my last trip, seeing only a few kayakers, until we finally reached the end of the beach and the final cave. There must have been 4 caves I explored already, and I couldn't get enough of it. We were amazed to see a fairly large cave with hundreds of rocks stacked on top of each other, right there in front of us. I had seen this plenty of times on the island, and I knew that these kinds of rocks signify you're in a sacred place that is not to be disturbed, but to be respected. The cave had a sense of intense quietness about it. My friend actually refused to enter because the way it felt. Fortunately for the existence of this story, I let myself be drawn right into my curiosity. I walked in between the rocks on the sand and into the cave. I turned to my right, noticing the cave funneling and sloping down for a distance of 30 feet. towards an even smaller entrance, within about 15 feet tall and 10 feet wide. Roughly, of course. This second entrance was total darkness, and within seconds of entering the larger cave, I turned looking and saw, in the second entrance, a white figure, skinny with bright eyes, staring my way. I literally would not have been able to see it had it not been so pale white. Another reason it stood out was its eyes. They glowed like a fish's eyes, and were about 3 times bigger than ours. It was at least 6 foot tall and naked. I didn't make out the exact facial features of it. There wasn't too much light. But here's the key point. I witnessed a very strange habit of this creature that would later cement its own existence to me. It did this behavioral thing where it only showed the left side of its body and kept the right side hidden behind the left-hand cave wall. Its left leg was not fully protruding, but the left arm was gripping the wall, and its head poking out. I noticed the creature at this point. Then, unsure that I had seen it, it moved its full left leg out and torso, and I saw most of its body, except its bottom right leg. We locked eyes, and after a moment of recognition from both sides, I swear to you, insect-like reflexes, it jolted back behind the left wall so quickly that I doubted that I had seen it at all. My eyes, adjusting to the pitch-black darkness, made me think I had just hallucinated it. And yet, I had certainly seen it. I described to my friend what I had seen, even got my headlamp on. I know that this was the dumb person in a horror movie thing to do, but I literally had this fire inside me, telling me I had to know what was in there. I felt like I had to make contact with something really important, and I had this longing that honestly came as a surprise to me with its intensity and inspiration. Try as might, I could not convince my friend to go in with me. I was like, come on, man. I really don't want to go in alone. Just come with me. But he was way smarter. Stayed watching me at the entrance. I tried 2 times to go beyond the threshold of the pitch-black second cave within. Too freaked out. But when I tried to leave and just let it go, in my mind, I just couldn't. How could I act like I just didn't care and leave? On the 3rd time I made it in, treading slowly, checking the ceiling with my headlamp, because honestly, this thing can probably climb walls as far as I know. Inspecting quickly, I noticed the whole room was empty. The second cave wasn't very big, but what I did notice was that to my left, the ceiling sloped down to the floor, and near where it would have met the ground was an opening. It was about 3 feet from the floor, and there was a small pool of water there that could have led into another cave beyond, or who knows what. At that point, I knew my limits. Seeing the reflexes I witnessed earlier, I knew there was just no way of catching up to it, and I left. My friend and I went back to camp, got some dead-ended answers from some locals about the experience, went to sleep that night feeling somewhat awkward, knowing what could be out there in the dark. We were both a bit skittish. I remember now, with any kind of sounds that were heard that night. Okay, so I would like to share my personal opinion about this sighting of this creature, which I refer to as a cave dweller. It is not a demon or evil. I didn't feel threatened or scared in any rational way. The only thing that was threatened was my belief that things like this cannot exist in this wide, vast universe within universes. I had this feeling like we were both at the same stage in our lives. I know it's hard to explain, but I had this feeling like we were both mirroring each other's respective experience in that one moment. I had this hit that I had a similar effect on it that it had on me. Maybe out of ignorance of my being, or maybe because I didn't just scream and run away. It saw me, and there was recognition in some way. I understand a little more how silly it is to expect that things don't happen to people every day, or maybe ever. At a time in my life where I'm growing more and more rational, I felt incredibly honored to have had this experience, to really open my mind to what's truly out there. I've seen a few videos with creatures like the one I saw. A great many of them are fake, and I did my best to research the ones I believe are real. When I first left the cave, my mind went through all these scenarios of doubt. I also took pictures of the cave because, at first, it was so genuinely amazing. But here's the frustrating part. I actually filmed a video that ended just minutes before I saw this thing, but it's still good. Thank you so much for reading. I hope somebody with a similar experience will feel validated by this story. I want to say that this may or may not have been a humanoid encounter. I may have just been dreaming. But if that's the case, I've never had a dream so absolutely lucid or realistic. In my dreams, I'm usually always compelled in my actions. But in this reoccurring situation, I'm in full control, and I can feel and smell everything. So, this first came about sometime when I was around 11 or 12, which puts this around 2009 or 2010. I can't really remember which. I just know it was this point when I frequently stayed with my great-grandma, shortly before my great-granddad passed away of cancer. It is in northwestern Georgia, in Chattooga County. Pretty rural, by most standards. Just a couple of thousand people around, anyway. I'd been staying with my great-grandparents then, in their pretty large house, in a very rural neighborhood. About 4 houses in total, all sparsely spread at the end of a road, somewhat near a nice lake and park. At some time, around 1 in the morning, I decided to get up from my bed, walk down the long hall to the living room, and get myself a glass of water from the kitchen that basically connects directly to the living room. Walk down the hall as normal, but when I approached the doorless entry to the living room, I instantly felt like something was wrong. It felt like time itself had slowed, and the moonlight that shined into the living room from our large side windows didn't quite look right. I then understood what was so amiss to me. The lights in the living room were on, but in a way, there was a yellowish light, like somebody had cut the lights on as normal, but it wasn't the same as what I had always grown up with. They were slightly off. I walked a few steps around the corner, thinking I'd figured out what was bothering me so much. Well, I was wrong. I turned the corner, and in the midpoint of the room, about 6 or 7 feet from me, was a tall figure in this obscure cloak. To the left and right of him were 2 much smaller figures, but they seemed to disappear as soon as I focused any attention to them. I can't even be sure what they looked like. The smaller ones were the classic gray alien shape that I am now aware of, but whenever I tried to glance to them, they just sort of faded into an indescribable there but not there shape. The best way I can describe it is if a shape became the static you would see on a TV screen, or if they had been drawings, they would have been hastily scribbled in. My eyes darted from the tall figure to them, at which point they sort of disappeared, and then back to the tall figure. This was all I could do before the tall one was alerted, seemingly by then disappearing. The tall one was somehow much more unnerving than the other 2. When I looked at him from behind, he was incredibly tall, reaching the ceiling. He had to hunch over a small bit in order to not hit his head. That was the strangest thing, though. When viewed from behind, his black cloak only extended up to the height of a very tall person, and ended. But when he turned around, he was much taller. It was like his head was totally invisible from behind. Now, the tall one is the biggest thing about this whole story. He turns around, and it's like everything around me just warped. Remember when I said earlier that everything felt wrong or out of place in general? It got intensified by several orders of magnitude as soon as he turned around. Somehow, seemed to gain several feet in height and look at me. He seemed very surprised that I was even there. Sound seemed to completely fade away, but I remember exactly what he smelled like. I couldn't place it then, but after spending the next several months visiting my great-granddad in the hospital, then going to his funeral, I can affirm that it was indeed the smell of death. The kind of smell that you only find in places with people dying. It's very specific. Not a horrible stench, but you can feel its morbidity. It's like it thickens the air. The moment he turned around and looked at me, two things happened. First, I became instantaneously paralyzed. I couldn't move. I could not scream. I could only stand. I did not feel like I was there, and I couldn't help but think that I shouldn't be there. I had an instant, overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there at that exact moment in time, that exact place. I saw his face. It was very much like what would be considered the standard gray alien face, although incredibly white. Not a bright white, but an unnaturally white form of white. Just dulled, blemish-free, no hair, no variance in coloration. He had a large conish head, small mouth, small nose holes, but his almond-shaped eyes were absolutely horrifying. I don't think I've ever seen anything remotely as disturbing. They looked like they didn't belong in this plane of existence, like a 2D or 4D object existing in a 3D world. I could only see his face, the rest of what I could assume to be his body, still underneath his black cloak. The worst came next. He seemed to just look at me in some form of panicked curiosity for a moment or two, with me still literally paralyzed in fear. Then, he produced a long arm from the side of his cloak, with thin, elongated fingers. He bent his body towards me, as though one would bend over to pick up something, but bent forward towards me. His mouth seemed to expand impossibly wide for his head. His hand creeped closer to me, and right as it touched my face, I lost consciousness, woke up the next morning. The scariest part of the whole ordeal was what I felt when he saw me. I was sure he was going to kill me, but not in a way you would expect, like the fear of getting stabbed or shot at. When he saw me, I felt like every part of me would be absolutely annihilated. I'm atheistic, and still was at the time, but it felt like for that one brief moment, I had a soul, and he was going to steal it from me. It's such an immense feeling of dread, thinking that even more than your very life is about to become nothing. When I woke up, everything was not as it was when I had went to sleep, or when I had woken up originally to get some water. That is what scares me most to this day, confirming to me that this was not a simple dream. While I had originally went to sleep in my bed in a room down the hall from the living room, I woke up in an obscure position on the living room couch. It was early in the morning, probably about 6 or 7 a.m., judging from the light outside. So, I went back into my bedroom, crawled into bed. It was only after I made it into my bedroom that I remembered what had just happened to me. I became mortified, covered myself under a blanket, and waited until I heard the sounds of my great-grandma cooking bacon in the kitchen. That was when I came out of my room and went back to the living room. Fast forward about 2 years later. My great-granddad is now dead. I'm a bit older, and I kept having dreams about the tall one that I saw that one night. I had these dreams somewhat often, but every time I would wake up in a cold sweat, usually unable to sleep for the rest of the night. The dreams were most frequently short after the first encounter, and every night for 4 nights in a row before the second, which I now detailed. The second time I saw him, it played out much like the first. I get out of bed, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, went to the kitchen to get a Dr. Pepper this time, instead of water. Around 3/4 of the way down the hall, I remembered what had happened that night, and I instantly freeze. I could feel them close again. I could feel the aura of wrongness that I had originally felt before the first time that I saw them. It's a very specific feeling. I try to turn around, sneak back to my room, or my great-grandma's, or my grandparents who had come to live with us after the death of my great-granddad. I couldn't turn around, though. I felt absolutely compelled to continue into the living room. It was like I didn't have a choice. But suddenly, I felt very okay with the idea. Like I was calm, despite what I knew was going to happen. Sure enough, in the living room was the tall one. But he was already facing the entrance to the living room, where I was walking from. And he was unaccompanied this time. He also did not smell. There was no smell. But I could hear a faint humming, and it sounded like it was coming from outside. We lived near a highway, so it could have been a car, but it did not sound like one. He knew that I knew he was there, and I'm pretty sure he was the one that calmed me and forced me to come into the living room. He seemed much more approachable this time, but he did the exact same as before. Studied me for a moment, with a very small smile, then put me to sleep with his hand. Again, I woke up on the couch. When I woke up, I felt less horrified about what had happened, and more curious as to why. I remember distinctly feeling like I was trapped by fate into seeing him multiple times, like I was sure it would happen again, whether I wanted it to or not. Throughout the years, I never distinctly remembered meeting him again, but he did appear in my dreams. I moved twice, and he was still there, about every 6 months. Sometimes it was a singular appearance in my dreams. Other times, it was up to 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, after I had the 3rd dream, I stayed up at night, sitting in the living room of my new house, waiting to see him. But I never did. Instead, I woke up, still in the living room, but upside down against my couch, with my legs up in the air, my upper back on the floor, and my lower back resting on the edge of the couch cushion. Several blankets were haphazardly spread around me, and my underwear was around my knees for some reason. I guess he knocked me out before I was able to see him, and he did whatever he does. And all this time, I still have no idea what he actually was doing, or why it was me. I still was very unnerved every time he was in my dreams, but I was less surprised. I haven't had a dream about him in nearly 2 years now, but I am posting this because I recently had a dream with a different entity. I'm pretty sure that it was one of the smaller beings that were with the tall one on the first encounter. He was a very stereotypical small gray alien, wearing a dull red, almost maroon cloak. He greeted me, and long story short, we wound up talking about a lot of things. He told me about the eventual fate of the world, succumbing to environmental issues if we did not stop pollution. He told me the countries of the world forming superpowers, eclipsing most smaller nations, one of them being formed from the US, the other from Russia, and 1 or 2 others coming from Australia and its surrounding lands, or maybe somewhere a short distance off the coast of southern Brazil. I'm not 100% sure, but I do remember the ones about the US and Russia. I asked him if he could share any technological information with me. He told me he could, but it would be limited. He was only permitted to show me a few things. I asked him for a source of limitless power. He drew up a diagram for me, and it struck me as an electrical diagram of some sort. But I knew that it made no sense, so it may be something else entirely. Anyway, this was a bit ago, so I can't be 100% certain of the exact diagram, but it was close. Maybe try hypnosis on me, or some other form to recall it better. I do know, however, that some sort of diagonal resistor-like symbol was in the location on the paper. There was some type of bulb-looking structure on the right side, although it might be inverted as compared to what's in the picture. I know there was a series of boxes with overlapping lines on the left. Anyway, that's the end of my tale for now. I sort of await my next encounter, as the hooded one in the dream did tell me we would meet again. Can someone please tell me if they know what the diagram might be of that I'm speaking about? Any thoughts or opinions on my experience? I really want to know what's been happening. I may not have been able to completely convey what happened right, as this was typed in a hurry. But if you have any questions or comments, please ask away. When I was in my first year of college, I lived with my mother by ourselves. My dad had passed the year before, and we moved out of the house shortly thereafter. I was glad because I had suffered a lot of paranormal trauma growing up, and I was glad to get out of that house. One night, I was driving home on Highway 111 north after youth group, and I saw something that still bewilders me. It was lightly raining that night. Mist crawled across the road from the cow fields on either side. The lights from the few gas stations nearby were reflected in the wet asphalt. I was driving about 3 car lengths behind a dark minivan with nobody else in sight on the roads. All of a sudden, I see the van swerve to miss something in the middle of the road. I was going too fast, and the road was too slick to miss it. All of a sudden, I saw, framed in my headlights and silhouetted in the glowing red brake lights of the van speeding away, a tall, muscular man with the upper shoulders and head of a buck. It was like a minotaur, but a deer head instead of a bull, and glowing red eyes. I clenched, bracing for impact, passing right through the figure. It was like it dissolved right into the mist. I'm used to swerving to miss deer at night, but I should have nailed this thing on the driver's side. Nothing. I was too afraid to look in the rearview mirror as I gassed it and sped home. I was only a couple of miles away, which was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. I raced in the door, locked it behind me. I told my mom, who laughed it off, but disconcerted at my pale, clammy complexion. I only later found out doing research that my description matched what I think I saw was a Wendigo, a Native American legend that was terrifying to me as a child, although I never heard of it described like this. I never heard of any creature like this until that night, that dark night on that highway. I will never forget it. We used to have a cabin up in northern Minnesota. I'll actually get specific, as this has been haunting me for a while. We used to have a cabin on McDougal Lake here in Minnesota. It was on the middle McDougal Lake and was very unpopulated. We used to hunt between Road 103 and 106. We'd usually set up stands along the Stony River. Let it be known that we had never seen anything out of the ordinary out there until my sophomore year of high school. My brother and I woke up earlier so we could get to the deer stand before the morning light. Spent the day at our stand, not hearing really anything. A deer came walking towards us on the logging road. We waited for a bit longer, as it was a solid 10-pointer. Then, out of nowhere, it runs off. My brother, muttering some curse words, headed back to our truck and parked along 103. As we're walking on the old logging trail, we began to almost feel lightheaded at that exact same time. I remember all my senses going into what I describe as hyperdrive. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid. We approached a hill, and suddenly, we heard the most disgusting scream ever. This thing ran from our left to our right, about 15 yards in front of us. It resembled a human, but was a different color. And the eyes, that is what I'll never forget. Its eyes were massive, and it ran in a bizarre sideways motion, but was really fast. I'll never forget hearing it continue to run off into the woods and then stop. We ran to our car, booked up back to the cabin. Next day, we come out with Papa, Dad, 2 uncles, and 3 cousins, and found the tracks. The only way I can possibly describe them is that they looked like an infinite sign with webbed appendages, and the imprint was further in the ground than the back part. My Papa, who had been in the woods his whole life, Native American who did tracking, and was also the director of human rights in Minnesota for a while, said, "We need to leave." He sold the cabin and never told us about it. To this day, things with big eyes terrify me. I actually screamed the first time I saw that ridiculously progressive ad on Facebook with her huge eyes. I am so glad I... 2007 to 2008. My cousin and I were often at my grandparents' in upstate New York, where we lived. Out in the country, they owned about 20 acres of old farmland, so there were many open spaces, about 5 acres of woods that my grandpa used to log. One night, me, my dad, my aunt, my uncle, and my cousin were camping at the cabin at the edge of the biggest field on the land, as we did usually during the summertime. At about 10 to 11, my dad, cousin, and I decided to go for a small walk to the other end of the field, conjoined to the large field. Outside expanses have always unnerved me, especially at night. So, I was a bit reluctant, but I went anyway. Once we crested the knoll and turned the corner from the cabin, so a small hedgerow was blocking us from eyeshot, we began to hear a violent rustling from the woods, along with branches snapping, so we all stopped. Once we stopped, 2 large creatures, one large one and a shorter, smaller one, ran by us, close enough for all of us to feel the wind blow by. These things were bipedal and fast. Faster than any biped I have ever heard of. They ran about 20 or 30 yards away from us. All of us, now frozen with fear and shock, and stopped, then turned to look at us once they felt they were at a safe distance. They just stood there, silent, with a curious or possibly frightened gaze for what appeared to be forever. They then turned and ran at the same speed for the rest of the 150 yards in 1 minute. As I said, they were extremely fast. As I've grown up, I've realized that many odd things can be seen and heard in rural New York. But this was the first and the last sighting I've ever had of this kind. I had the most amazing experience at our local Walmart, of all places, in Plymouth, Indiana, about 10 or so years ago. It was a normal day where my daughters, both teenagers at the time, and I went to the store around noon to go get some groceries. After I parked the car and was getting out, I noticed the car I parked beside had a mixed theme going on of extreme gothic hippie 70s. I've seen a lot of themes in my day, but never those two combined together. I sort of chuckled, thought it reminded me of somebody trying to blend in that wasn't from around here. My daughters agreed it was unusual, a very unusual combination of decor, but they thought it was cool. As we were walking into the store, there was a couple in their late 20s coming out pushing their cart. I knew right away this couple belonged to the vehicle I parked beside. I smiled at them and said hello. They both looked at each other, and then at me, without saying anything. I thought they were an adorable-looking couple. Both very tall and lean, elongated faces. Their arms were longer than most people's. They looked very much alike, as though they were brother and sister, but were acting as though they were a couple. Even their hairstyles were identical. Both had long, straight black hair cut in the same style. Their apparel matched their vehicle, a combo of extreme gothic with hippie 70s style. They were lacking jewelry of any kind. You know, The jewelry was hanging on the rearview mirror in the car. Neither had piercings or tattoos. I'm going to give a little background story to help readers grasp the feel of Plymouth. If you weren't born and raised here, you would probably think you'd stepped into the episode of The Twilight Zone. I was raised in a small town 50 miles away where everyone was welcome, and a stranger was just a new friend in the making. We greeted everybody we came across with a smile and a few kind words. We moved here in 1997, noticed right away that people here were not very friendly if they did not know you. Heaven forbid, smiling at somebody and saying hello to somebody you do not know. You don't see anybody in the crowded store stopping in the aisles, talking with one another. To this day, most of the residents walk along, looking down at the ground. I don't know if it's something you ever get used to, but it becomes the norm to see on a daily basis. You can spot another outsider a mile away, because they're friendly. The first words out of their mouths are, "Oh, you aren't from here, are you?" Okay, back to the phenomenal experience that day. I'm not sure if it all started with me smiling and saying hello to the couple coming out of the doors as we were going in, but that's the moment it began. As my daughters and I were going through the store, we spotted the couple again, inside, pushing their cart as though they had not left the store. I remember thinking they must have forgotten something and came back to get more items. I noticed them checking out again, and then the fun begins. We did a ton of zigzagging through the store, as is usual when shopping with two teenage girls. I had just watched the couple push their cart back outside into the parking lot. Then seconds later, they appeared right beside us, pushing their cart past us. I lit up like a kid at Christmas, because it was impossible for them to get from outside parking lot to where they were in the span of a few seconds. I asked the girls if they saw that too, and they both nodded, looked at me like, how do they do that? We all started laughing. They were jumping time, or able to jump from one distance to another, in just seconds. It became hilarious at one point when we were looking around to see if anybody else was seeing what we were. If anybody else did, they surely weren't letting on like they were seeing it. It was like old times in Plymouth, with everybody looking down at the ground as you walked by them. I can't really explain what was going on, other than they were playing around, having a blast doing it. 1 minute, you'd spot them, and then poof, they were just gone. I told my girls I wanted to be able to do that. Be one place, and then next thing you know, appear 200 yards away. As we were leaving the store, headed to our car, the couple walked past us again, headed into the store, but they had just been behind us at the checkout. Was it all because we noticed them as we were leaving the store? I'll never know. What I do know is we all had fun that day and enjoyed the euphoric experience and are thankful that we were allowed to see their capabilities and share their fun. I was given a gift that day, and I will always cherish. The gift of knowing we have visitors here from other places, and at the right time, being allowed to see the impossible. I confess, I felt like a kid again that day, where anything and everything was possible. I'm still learning for how to jump from point A to point B in the blink of an eye. My best friend called me later that day, and I was so excited to tell her about my experience. She was supposed to have gone along with us that day, and she was bummed out that she had missed it. She asked me if I would go to the store with her, and so I said yes. She came and picked me up. I told her that I highly doubted that they would still be around, but she wanted to check it out anyway. I only live about 20 minutes from the store, and it probably took her another 20 to get from her house to pick me up. As we pulled into Walmart, there was this massive vehicle, the size of a luxury camper. It was all black, tinted windows, and a satellite on top, parked at the back of the parking lot. I got a really eerie feeling from it, and wondered if it might be my phone conversation had been overheard by somebody, or maybe whoever was working with the security camera feed at the store had somehow maybe spotted the couple on the tapes, popping back and forth between different parts of the store and parking lot. Whatever the case, I had a bad feeling that they were looking for the couple. I've never come across that same couple in town again, but have had some unique encounters since, and have listened about a few other encounters from other people. My friend signed up with some internet site she received through an email where you can report activity if you've seen something. It was some live application. I'd have to ask her what the name of it was. They had some strange happenings going on, so she reported it. She calls me the next day crying. She felt horrible about it. She told me that the trucks with trailers and military vehicles pulled up. Dozens of men, dressed in camo, combing the fields and swamp area by her house down the road, by her sister's house. I asked her what she thought was going on, and she really had no idea. She just got caught up in the moment and reported the incident. We have no idea if there's a correlation. With such rapid response time to reported sightings, and even unreported sightings, I believe that here is a being monitored regularly. Galaxies or dimensions. They're definitely here living among us, and blending in quite well.